bring a boy.
Yep. Here we are recording.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have everybody here on this kind of
It's like Scott and the Reedies are with us.
somewhat humid Sabbath. It's kind of cold humidity out there.
Humidity?
Kind of a cold that kind of gets to right to the center of your core.
Tomadiddy.
So,
Hamidity.
anyway, great to have you joining us online if you've tuned in. It's wonderful to have folks joining us from all over the country and all over the world, actually. We are just sitting here in our family room discussing things of Scripture, doing what anybody could be doing, actually. And great to have you tagging along for sure. We get a real blessing by not only coming together ourselves, but then we have others that contact us, and there are people that routinely join us from Canada and other states and countries. We're just blessed to know that it means something to the folks out there. So thank you for sharing some of your thoughts and your questions and comments. We do value them all. So, but as always, we start out with prayer, so I'm going to invite you just to bow your heads, pause a moment with me, and let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we want to thank you once again for who you are and how you take such good care of us. We want to pray for the Compton family this morning as we've experienced the loss of a dear brother, Kenny. And Lord, we just know that you are the God who brings comfort and peace, and so we're asking that you would do that for family and friends this morning. Ken went through the last few weeks. It was pretty rough for him, but thankfully he's resting now on your Sabbath, which seems so appropriate. So thank you for your mercy. We want to ask also, Lord, that you be with the rest of the folks that are on our prayer list. There are many challenges that are out there, things that folks have made known to us, and we're just trusting you as we lift them up in faith, that you will handle every situation and every case. Lord, we want to ask that as we come together, that your Spirit will be here to instruct us, to teach us, to direct our conversation and our thoughts. We need your insight, understanding. We need to prepare for what lies ahead. And we are trusting you, Lord, to fit us up for the task at hand. And we know that wearing your armor, we are quite able to accomplish whatever it is that you ask us to do. Forgive us where we have failed. Help us to be more like you. Help others to see the Spirit of Christ in us, that their lives might be impacted in a miraculous way. We ask these things in Jesus' most wonderful name, for his sake. Amen. Okay, well, thank you for praying along with us. And we trust that the Lord will help you to receive the blessing that he has stored up on this holy Sabbath day. Special time. And I guess that what we'll do is go ahead and continue our story, dealing with spiritual warfare. And it's kind of a novel, but it's something in reality that's taking place all the time. And so we're gaining insight and understanding as a result.
Yeah, when we left off, they were still in that business meeting, and the old elderly lady had shown up despite the fact that she was sick.
Right. They're getting ready to tally up the votes.
Right.
And to decide whether or not the pastor is going to stay or go, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that the thing?
Yeah. Just then the door opened. Oh no, thought Brummel, who's coming in this time? The silence fell like a shroud of death over the whole group. Lou Stanley had just come in. He grimly nodded greeting to them all and took a seat in the back pew. He looked old. Gordon Mayer piped up, "Let's have the vote." The ushers passed out the ballots while Brummel tried to plan a good escape route in case he had to throw up. His nerves were just about shot. He caught Lou Stanley's attention. Lou looked at him and seemed to laugh nervously. "Make sure Lou back there gets a ballot," Brummel told one of the ushers, and the usher made sure. Kyman whispered to Gilo, "I think we're ready for any tricks Lucius might have." "Any tiebreakers, you mean?" Gilo answered. "We may be in for a long night," said Mota. The ballots were collected, and Lucius kept his demons tightly around each offering plate and his eyes on every heavenly warrior. Mayer and Coleman counted again as the tension in the air tightened. The demons watched, the angels watched, and the people watched. Mayer and Coleman kept a close eye on each other, silently mouthing as they counted. Mayer finished counting and waited for Coleman to finish. Coleman finished and looked at Mayer and asked if he wanted to count again, so they counted again. Then Mayer took his pen, wrote the result on a slip of paper, and carried it up to Brummel. Mayer and Coleman took their seats as Brummel unfolded the paper. Visibly shaken, Brummel took a few moments to put on his relaxed, businesslike public image. "Well," he began, trying to control the tone of his voice. "All right, then. The pastor has been retained." One side of the room loosened up and smiled, and the other side gathered up their coats and belongings to leave. "Alf, what was the vote?" someone wanted to know. It doesn't say." 28 to 26, Gordon Mayer said accusingly, looking back at Lou Stanley. But Lou Stanley had left. So he came in and cast a vote in favor of the pastor, even though they were blaming the pastor for him being removed from fellowship.
It's really interesting, I would say probably most congregations throughout the country.
There's a little bit of continuation on here. Do you want me to finish this?
Yeah, I will. I'll give you a second. They have been through this kind of thing before. Probably almost every congregation in the country has been through this kind of circumstance where you have within a church, and we talked about this a little bit last week, you have factions that develop within congregations, and typically one is more liberal and one is more conservative, and the one side doesn't like the other side, and et cetera, et cetera. There's this division.
That's the devil's specialty.
Division that's created within most congregations. And I mean, in this circumstance here, will all of those people that are there voting, will they say to themselves, okay, the vote went our way, we're happy about that, and everything's going to continue on? And what's the other side going to say? Are they going to say, well, the vote didn't go our way, but this is our church, and we're going to stay here and work and cooperate?
You just don't know.
You just don't know. Typically, that doesn't happen. Typically, the people that are voted, that wanted the pastor gone, will leave and form a new congregation somewhere else. I mean, isn't that usually what happens?
Mm-hmm.
Because they basically say, churches are a voluntary thing, and nobody's getting paid to be there. And so, typically, I mean, but my question is this to you guys: isn't that the better thing? Isn't it better for people kind of to go their own way and be a part of something that they enjoy, something that they believe, compared to trying to stay there and kind of fight one another? I would think it would be better for the first doctrine than to have an example of discord and hostility and outright, the same thing actually occurred with Jesus.
Okay, they're saying that Jerry sounds far away. The microphone is on, but maybe the setting here, Elijah. You want to check it and make sure it's set properly?
Dad is far away.
Dad is far away.
Far out, Dad.
Didn't the same thing happen with Jesus, though? When he came, the Jews had really perverted much of an understanding of the law, particularly, by adding all these restrictions and stipulations and all this kind of thing, and particularly in regards to the Sabbath truth. So here you had Jesus coming into, the equation, basically stepping into the Jewish culture and economy, and they really ended up hating him. I mean, even from his birth on, there was this sentiment against him because it was the lowly shepherds in the field that made the announcement, the birth of the Messiah. And the Jews were the leadership. The Sanhedrin was kind of put on the sideline, and they really didn't take that well. They wouldn't even go to Bethlehem to verify the account because they had a different expectation. But right from his birth on, there was this animosity that was building, and finally when he was 30 and started his own rabbinical ministry, man, just within 3.5 years, they grew to hate him to the point where they wanted to kill him. I mean, come on, that's pretty severe. In fact, they were basically saying, we're not going to allow this guy to be a part of our economy here. We're going to get rid of him. We must get rid of him. And I think that attitude really develops within a lot of congregations when you have this kind of thing happening. They can't tolerate the other people being in charge or having their own way. And what have I really just described? I just described the whole political scenario that we experience in our own country here. We've got these two sides, and one side can't tolerate the other side being in power, so they do everything they can to fight against any success that they would have, and then vice versa. When the other side's in power, the other thing happens, So it's just craziness. I mean, the church ought to be, the body of believers ought to be a major step above in their thinking process, and we ought to be able to tolerate one another a lot more judiciously even than we do. Just because we don't get our own way of maybe things about the building, or things about what's being taught, what's being allowed to be taught. So who ultimately do we believe is in charge of the whole thing? We believe that Christ is in charge of the body. And so there has to be a measure of trust, that he will ultimately bring about a positive result. In fact, Scripture tells us that ultimately there will be a positive result. He will eventually come and to rescue the living saints and to resurrect the ones that have gone by the way of the grave. So it all comes down to really trusting God to work through these obstacles that we have. And also, I think the other thing is that we need to recognize that we're all different. We have different likes and dislikes. We're on different rungs of the ladder, spiritually speaking. People have studied more than others. There are people that are content with a superficial understanding of things. Okay, but they're there still, so we need to just kind of have some tolerance. But at the same time, we need to make sure the standards are presented, at least presented, so that the standard of Scripture is presented. And we have a whole Christian culture that's wanted to do away with the law of God because it's uncomfortable to them. And they don't want to honor the standard that God has established. Mama Rose, did you want to continue? Or is that a possibility?
You fix the audio?
Not yet. It's not quite even showing up at the same settings that it normally does. It looks like the audio is coming from the mic. Doesn't look like it's coming from your computer, maybe. It might be coming from your computer.
She says still very quiet and far away. But mine's probably loud because I'm right by the microphone.
So what will be interesting in the story is to see, are you beginning?
This is just beginning with the reactions.
This is the laptop audio, I'm pretty sure. I'm just not seeing the setting for...
That's what I thought. The settings look like they've changed somehow.
Yeah.
But it had an update this morning.
Okay. I was going to ask if you had... Did you turn all this stuff on before you turned this on?
Yes.
That normally screws it up.
No, I did it first the other way, and then I rebooted the computer when it wasn't getting audio.
But this was already still on?
Yeah.
Yeah, normally that confuses it.
All right.
So you'll probably want to...
So you need to have the computer up and then turn on the camera? Or vice versa? Let's just get the desktop set up today and we won't worry about it anymore.
Yeah, I would try just resetting the stream and just popping back up and see if it fixes it.
All right. So we want to finish the last little bit of this chapter. It says, Tal, Signa, and the other sentries could see the explosion from where they stood. Remember, they were outside the church. With cries and wails of rage, demons scattered everywhere, erupting through the roof and the sides of the church like shrapnel, fanning out in all directions over the town. Their cries became a loud, echoing drone of savage fury that rang over the whole town like 1,000 melancholy factory whistles. They will wreak havoc tonight, said Tal. Mota, Kaiman, and Guilo were there to report. By 2 votes, said Mota. Tal smiled. Very well, then. But Lou Stanley, Kaiman exclaimed. Was that really Lou Stanley? Tal caught the implication. Yes, that was Mr. Stanley. I've been standing right here ever since I delivered Edith Duster. So I see the spirit has been working, Guilo chuckled. Well, let's get Edith home safely and get a guard around her. Everyone to your posts. There will be angry spirits over the town tonight. And that night the police were busy. Fights broke out in the local taverns. Slogans were spray-painted on the courthouse. Cars were stolen and joy-ridden through the lawn and flowers in the park. But late into the night, Julian Langstratt hovered in an inescapable trance, halfway between a tormented life on earth and the licking, searing flames of hell. She lay on her bed, tumbled to the floor, clawed her way up the wall to stand on her feet, and staggered about the room, only to fall to the floor again. Threatening voices, monsters, flames, and blood seemed to explode and pound with force in her head. She thought her skull would burst. She could feel claws tearing at her throat and creatures squirming and biting inside her, chains around her arms and legs. She could hear the voices of spirits and see their eyes, smell their breath. The masters were angry. Failed, 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 pounded in her brain and paraded before her eyes. Brummel has failed, you have failed, now he will die and you will die. Did she really hold a knife in her hand, or was this too a vision from the higher planes? She could feel a yearning, a terribly strong impulse to be free of the torment, to break loose from the bodily shell and the prison of flesh that bound her. Join us, said the voices. She felt the edge of the blade and blood trickled down her finger. The telephone rang. Time seemed to freeze. The bedroom registered on her eyes and the telephone rang again. She was in her bedroom, but there was blood on the floor. The telephone rang. The knife fell from her hands and she could hear angry voices. And the telephone rang again. She was on her knees to the floor of her bedroom. She had cut her finger. The phone was still ringing. She called out hello, but the phone was still rang. I won't fail you, she said to her visitors. Leave me, I won't fail you. The telephone continued to ring. Alf Brummel sat in his home, listening to the phone ringing on the other end. Julene must not be home. He hung up and was relieved, if only for the moment. She would not be happy about the vote. Another delay, still another delay in the plan. He knew he could not avoid her, that she would find out, that he would be confronted and berated by the others. He flopped down on his bed and contemplated resigning, escaping, even suicide. Amazing that you can see when you begin to see the interplay, and the devil only wants to take you to that edge. He wants to destroy.
Sure.
That's all he's looking to do.
Yeah, we'll follow that up next week. What's interesting about some of the comments that you were making there in the story, I don't think most people ever make the connection of when decisions don't go the devil's way and the reactions that take place throughout society during that time. You were saying that fights were breaking out. There was an overactivity of criminal activity that evening. The police were very busy because of certain things, and it all could have stemmed from the decision that was made at the church. And we think, okay, that's just in the story. That doesn't happen in real life. But it very much does. And I think what the story is emphasizing to us is that there are outcomes and there are reactions that take place
He's still far away.
as a result of spiritual decisions and choices that are made. And I don't think most people ever make the connection, but those things are really connected. And it also means that God is also working in a miraculous way through his angel servants to cause things to take place. And that's really what the story is all about, is that warfare that's going on behind the scenes that most people are unaware of. So we'll pick it up next week. Well, Sim's now feeling, he's under the weather a little bit. He's here with us. We're going to continue our series on the law. And I've got it right here in front of me. Somebody had sent us these nice tablets. Actually, we have the Hebrew on one side, and of course these are granite. The English on the other side here. But we're on the commandment, you shall not murder, or thou shalt. Let's look at the way that it reads here in Exodus. Okay, so we're on this is commandment number 6. And the New King James says, you shall not murder. Does it say, in the regular King James, does it use the word kill?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between killing, and I think it says in the King James killing, right? Thou shalt not kill.
Mm-hmm.
And in the New King James it says murder. What's the difference between the two? And Sim, did you have any particular? I didn't realize I was going to be leading out till a few minutes ago, but did you have anything in here that was going to take us in a certain direction? You might want to kind of steer us in the right path.
Hey, you know you're welcome to put stuff in that box is for mail. Oh yeah, it won't be wet inside. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. You put the mail in your car. I saw someone walking up to your car.
Yeah.
I thought, who's going? And then I realized it was the mailman.
You're going the right direction.
Who was it?
Mailman. He was putting the mail in the lodges and calls his car. I said the red box is there.
Okay, so the King James says, "Thou shalt not kill." The New King James says, "Thou shalt not murder." Is there a difference between those two things? Heads are nodding.
She said the audio is better now, so whatever you did must have helped.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's a difference between the two. Murder denotes something that is unlawful or unjust, perhaps, as opposed to killing, which in a more generic term could be like judicial punishment or
Animal sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. So, what's the difference? The difference is what? There would be a purpose.
Yeah, I guess the difference would be the intent.
The intent and the purpose. A purpose for one thing, if you're doing a sacrifice that God is asking for. And wouldn't that sacrifice, thinking of the sacrificial system, wouldn't that have been necessary back in the Jewish dispensation? Right?
This thing indicates that the word kill in Strong's Concordance implies killing a person, manslayer. It uses the word murder, but it also uses slayer and manslayer.
Mm-hmm.
So it really has more to do with premeditated, or in anger or something like that.
Right. Intentionally doing harm.
So the primitive root means properly to dash in pieces. So it implies a violent
violent type of thing.
Way to kill.
Right.
But
obviously there wouldn't be a prohibition against killing everything in general, like anything living, because you would have the sacrificial system to deal with animals, and people eat them for food. So
Some people eat people for food.
did I say people?
No, I said no. You just said they would eat the animals for food.
Sometimes I question. My brain doesn't always connect with my mouth the right way.
One of the things that as I kind of looked at these commandments here, who's God really talking to here?
To Israel?
I mean, in a general sense, right? He's giving them to Israel, giving the precepts to Israel. Of course, he's writing them down, but he's writing them down. But these are principles that have already been in existence since the very beginning of time. The law was written on the heart. In other words, Adam. Adam already was aware of these principles, and I'm sure was promoting them to his children and grandchildren, etc. Some of them obviously were being ignored. Cain rose up, and when Cain rose up and killed his brother, the Bible says that he sinned. Well, if there was no prohibition against that, then he couldn't have, but he did, because it was in existence. So you know that these principles existed from the very beginning. Do you have to take somebody's life to kill them?
You mean personally, like?
Yeah, I mean, how broad is the commandment here? Thou shalt not kill. Does that necessitate the taking of a life? And if there were certain scriptures that you wanted me to turn to, just point them out to me.
This is a Moses and Aaron situation today.
The Bible doesn't originally say kill. It's only in the King James Version. It's like the only one that actually has the reference for kill. Everything else is murder, which is the more accurate way to put it.
The reading said the difference is intent,
Sure.
intentions.
Murder is generally premeditated and planning on killing somebody. It's unlawful and unjust killing.
Right.
That's what murder means. Killing could be accidental. That's why you say, I killed a mosquito instead of I said I murdered a mosquito.
Right.
Also, in the case of accidental killing, there was a provision with the cities of refuge
Right.
that you could go to
Right.
if it was an accidental killing, but not if it was premeditated.
Yeah, someone falls off a building while you're doing construction and dies. It's not a murder necessarily. They fell off and was killed.
Sure. And that's why investigations are take place, so that people can determine that, whether it was something premeditated or not.
So would it be murder for you to, like, bully someone to death, let's say? Like,
You bully them to the point where they kill
yeah,
themselves?
where they kill themselves, yeah.
You can't. Technically, that would be today because it's a call to action and a sort. So you.
Yeah, I've heard things of not only bullying, but I've heard of kids getting messages from their friends at school telling them to kill themselves. It's
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
Which is a call to action, which is illegal. So, at least in our culture, it's considered murder.
Yeah, and there have been people that have been held responsible for that very thing.
Right.
Because you can push somebody with your words. You don't have to push them with your hands necessarily, but you can push them with their words, and they end up going over the cliff. So.
Well, I mean, Jesus takes the commandments as far as to say things like, even if you hate somebody in your heart, it's murder.
Matthew 5:21.
So to
Matthew
To-
5:21.
to provoke somebody to the point of suicide I would say definitely qualify as murder.
falls under this, and they should be held responsible. Absolutely. So, another question. What else did you want to bring out about this particular commandment here? What else did you want to bring out in here?
Matthew 5:21.
Isn't that the one we just really referenced?
Kind of.
Okay, let me read it. Matthew 5:21. It simply says, "You have heard that it is said to those of old, you shall not murder. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Rakah," we'll get a kind of a definition for Rakah, "shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift." So, obviously this is talking about a situation where you have something, you have a problem with somebody else.
Or they have a problem with you.
Or they have a problem with you. But here, you're at the altar entreating God for a blessing, I'm sure. And God says, "Oh, wait a minute. You have hate in your heart. Right? Go and deal with that first before I can deal with you."
So that's an interesting footnote in here in the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was the original kind of the favorite of the Protestants, especially before the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower. I've been comparing it with the King James this week in a lot of instances, but that Bible had a lot of footnotes and references, like it was a study Bible, one of the first ones. And under this commandment, under the word kill, they have, "Thou shalt not kill, but love and preserve thy brother's life." It's an interesting, bringing it out a little bit more fully.
So, really, I mean, what this section of Scripture really is indicating is, and there are a lot of people that have lots of problems with others. In dealing with one another, we don't want to tolerate some of the things that develop. And if things fester too long, that develops into not just dislike, but hatred.
Susan says the word rakah is original to the Greek manuscript. However, it is not a Greek word. The most common view is it's a reference to the Aramaic word rekah, which literally means empty one. It probably meant empty-headed or foolish.
Yeah. So you could say to someone, you're kind of being stupid, right? Or you're ignorant. But that's a far cry from developing an attitude of hatred, where you want maybe something to befall someone that would be injurious to them. I mean, it's not our place, because it's never an individual's place to make a determination about whether somebody should live or die. That's what's so wrong with abortion. It's just the legislators are trying to tell the woman, "Oh, you as an individual can make a choice whether somebody lives or dies." That's never a good policy.
You see, I mean, it gets to be taken to an extreme, because you go, well, if you get to decide that at that stage of the life, then why don't you get to decide that at any stage of the life?
Well, that's just where it's going. You can see that's what people
They're
are
5 years old
legislating
and you
now.
decide they're a nuisance.
They're taking it in that direction, of course.
Why can't you do that to a 5-year-old? Why can't you do that to?
Right. What if they get sick and develop some kind of disability that you don't want to deal with? We've got a granddaughter who just developed, started having these seizures. What if their parents all of a sudden decided, well, hey, we don't want to deal with this thing. This is just, too burdensome on the rest of the family, so we just want to get rid of her. I mean, that really is the thinking that a lot of people are developing these days. Or somebody that's elderly, hey, let's just get rid of them. That concept has been around for a long time. So when you become technically a burden on society, You know, should the sanctity of life follow you all the way through, or should people come to an understanding that, well, once you become a burden on society or families or whatever, they just need to get rid of you. You know, time for you to step aside. You know, you've lived your life, etc., etc. You know, so I mean, but in this case here, in Matthew 5, we're talking about really relational issues. And obviously people, at some point in somebody's life, you're going to have your irregular person. Joyce Landorf talks about your irregular person. How somebody that you just can't tolerate, you just can't get along, they just rub you the wrong way. And yet, oftentimes people are thrown into circumstances, whether it's a work relationship, or whether it's a family relationship, or something where you just don't want to be around certain individuals. And I think all of us, at some point in our lives, we have an irregular person or persons that we just want to stay away from. And right now I can just see your minds, you're thinking about, oh yeah, that person's my irregular person. You know, and maybe out there you're thinking of one too. But Christ would have us develop a spirit of love and tolerance for everybody. We don't have to agree with people. And certainly anybody else is not you, so you're not going to agree 100% with anybody.
Scott says, yes, murder is an intentional taking of a life with malicious intent. Killing is an act to end a life that could have a righteous connotation, such as killing the Passover lamb.
Sure. And listen, some people have a problem with the Old Testament in general because God gave directive to His people to eliminate certain groups as they would encounter them, not to tolerate, not to leave them alive, if you will. And some people have a real issue with that, you know. But what did God know that we wouldn't know? He has foreknowledge, right? He has omniscience. He knows where things are going to go ultimately. And here His people were at a critical juncture of infancy in their development, in their relationship with Him, coming, you know, basically from Sinai itself. And so he's looking for a people that will be held up as being distinct from everybody else around. And what he knew was that if they allowed certain groups of people to remain alive, there'd be an intermingling, which eventually, of course, did occur at some point along the way. As we read through these stories, and of course it became very detrimental, so much so that God said your probation is going to end as a nation at some point. You know, now that's pretty severe. That, you know, here God chooses you to be different, chooses you to be peculiar, chooses you to be, you know, His special missionary endeavor to the world. And because of your indifference, because of you allowing, not keeping the profane and the holy separate, you end up as a nation being set aside, and God using a different group, if you will, to finish the work, to do what He originally intended with the Jews themselves. So, not that individuals can't come to the Lord and be saved, but now it's the Christian dispensation that takes the gospel message to the world, not the Jewish dispensation.
So, God commanded the people, the children of Israel, to kill every woman, child, and man.
In some cases.
Yeah, so like, was it because He didn't want the sins that were in the promised land to, like, you know, like whatever bad thing that they were doing there, so the Israelites wouldn't, like,
Yeah, you got to remember, Yeah, you got to remember, I mean, God knows all the circumstances, of course, and all the particulars. He has all the insight. And sometimes his directive would seem at odds with this very commandment here, thou shalt not kill. You know, but what he knows is that there would be a contamination. Remember, his people are coming out of a lot of Egyptian philosophy that's not true. And so he's trying to re-educate them. He's trying to raise up a people that are distinct from the world, so that the world then can say, wow, there's a choice here. We can honor the true God of heaven, or we can honor all of these little gods down here. So God's trying to accomplish something major in showing a difference between the holy and the profane. And if he allowed them to intermingle or allow a certain group of people to stay alive, they would become contaminated with a lot of that same philosophy, and there would be no distinction. So God knows that the only course that he has is to eliminate a certain group. And the reason for the elimination of men, women, and children is not that he's harsh. He just understands the heredity. You know, if you just killed the men and the children grew up, they're going to have resentment and intolerance to the people of God. And of course, actually we see this playing out throughout the Old Testament. You know, God was always trying to put them in check, like the Philistines and the different groups that were against the development of Israel. Even today, you know, you've got an ideology that places itself against Israel even still today. You know, like a sibling rivalry that's still going on. And if you've ever been over to Israel, if you were to go over there and just feel the tension that's there and talk to some of the people, they would tell you, you know, we hate the Jews. Well, why do you hate the Jews? Well, we don't know, but because they're Jewish. Right? And the Jews don't want to tolerate the Arabs either. You know, the descendants of Ishmael, they don't want to tolerate them either, because they know they're hated. And so, you know, they shoot rockets into, you know, the different cities, and then Israel retaliates. And so you get this hatred that's just festering, just going on. In order to have hatred, you have to have at least two people. Well, what if you eliminate one of those people? One of those persons. If you eliminate one, then hatred would tend to diminish and go away. There's nobody to hate. You know? So, well, that too. That's a whole other issue. But you know, you've got this thing that's just ongoing. But there were times in the Old Testament where God knew that his people were particularly vulnerable, and he had to try to do what he could, and so he would instruct them, take them out. You know, they're you know, not going to change. They're not going to be influenced in a positive direction. Better to get rid of them. So. And people have people that have a general regard for life, they have a little bit of an issue with those things. It's hard sometimes to know that God is always right in his judgment. He's as merciful as he can be, and he's always correct in his judgment. So sometimes that's a hard thing for us to consider.
And Mom wanted me to share some comments. Just from Scott. It says Moses instructed the judges to kill those men who had joined themselves to the Baal of Peor. Just one instance there.
Elijah on the altar.
Elijah on the altar.
Killing all the prophets.
Yeah, and then another one says sanctuary cities were established in the Promised Land so people could escape to if they had accidentally killed or murdered someone until their case could be heard to determine
six sanctuary cities.
Yeah, to determine if the killer violated the sixth commandment or not.
Witness protection.
I mean, if one of your family members were killed accidentally, right, the family would want to retaliate and so forth, and that's why you had to flee. and they had to have some time to process to see exactly what was what in that situation. And then once you went through that process, you could leave those cities, etc., and be relinquished from any responsibility and justified in leaving if your case turned out in a positive way. So some people opted always to stay because they felt more secure there.
Yeah.
But
it's also interesting that the entire Jewish legal system was designed to try to bring the sinner to repentance and the wicked one back into fellowship, to preserve their life and to bring them back into full relationship.
Sure.
It wasn't designed to just punish and destroy.
Yeah. What were some of the things, as Israel was going through the wilderness and whatnot, there were a lot of stipulations that Moses was instructed to bring to the people. Some of those stipulations required the transgressor to be killed. What were some of those things?
It required the transgressor to be killed.
Yeah.
Pretty much breaking many of the commandments.
How about something like incorrigible youth? Sometimes the Bible tells us that from as young people grow up, some of them really develop intolerable attitudes about things.
Yeah.
What about some of the priests that worked in the sanctuary and the tabernacle? There was always a limit to God's forbearance. Okay? There were certain lines, certain boundaries that God established, and you could not step over that line without repercussions. How about when they were at Mount Sinai even? And in fact, God wanted to wipe them all out, right? And Moses intervened, right? When he came down. But still at Mount Sinai, how many people were killed at Mount Sinai? You remember?
It was a huge number, right?
3,000 people were killed at Mount Sinai. Now, what's interesting is that the Bible talks about the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost, there were a number of souls added to the church. How many were added? 3,000, right? And what's interesting is that was the same day. And I don't mean the same moment in time. I mean the same day of the year. The 3,000 were lost in the Sinai, in Arabia there. The same day, years later, 1,500 years later, whatever, the same day, 3,000 souls were added to the church. So quite interesting. Little trivia there, but there have been lots of times where God has this line in the sand, if you will, and you couldn't step over. Now, was God just being harsh there? Is this just a commandment that's harsh? It's intolerant? What's the deal? What does it say about God? Ultimately, that's the thing that I think maybe where sin wanted to take it. What does it say about God that He would have? You don't come back from this. This isn't just this is a penalty you don't come back from. This isn't something where you have to pay a fine or spend some time incarcerated. You don't come back from this.
I think that's why it should always be something that is a last resort in terms of punishment, because even when we look at the Old Testament punishments, let's say, for when they would break the law, something like breaking the Sabbath or cursing God, like the Egyptian, half Jewish youth did. I think it was a penalty that was enacted for people who were beyond redemption in certain regards. Like they were too stubborn to return and repent. And because I mean that seemed to be kind of the issue with the kid, is that whatever he said was serious enough, and he seemed to be adamant enough about it that it became an issue. But I think even for God, I think it's somewhat of a last resort. You know, like when they were trekking across and they were commanded to destroy those nations that were around them. If I remember correctly, it was mostly self-defense in a way. Like these were nations that were coming up against them, and in terms of what they would have possibly done to corrupt Israel, as many of the nations did over those time periods, kind of testify to why it would have, like why they needed to be put out. I don't know.
Does this commandment basically, is it an indication that really God is the only one that has the authority and the full knowledge to know when it's appropriate to take the life of someone?
I think he's the only one who can do it fairly. But I mean, I also think to a small measure he has given a temporary aspect of that authority to man in different ways, under his guidance, let's say.
Yeah, and we obviously don't get it right all the time. There are some, people could cite example after example of how people have unjustly been put to death and this kind of thing. So even going through the process, sometimes it doesn't work well. But back here in the Old Testament, where God was directing specifically, we have to trust that He had the full information. I mean, He's the life giver. So why would the life giver, counter by taking life, if it wasn't absolutely necessary? And that's the thing, that's the conclusion, it really comes down to a trust for who He is, for this to be appropriate. But apart from all that we've discussed there, I think the more important thing is what's in Matthew 5 here, and that is you don't have to take a life to actually be killing someone, in a sense. What if you were to kill their reputation? How easy does that occur today? Where
just look at politics.
Yeah, I mean, people are set up. There are accusations that are made that are not true, et cetera, and people's reputations are often destroyed with little or no regard to the repercussions of that kind of thing. So this principle, I think, is a lot broader than just the taking of a life or the cessation of a life. Much broader than that. And I think that's really what Matthew 5 is addressing here. You can destroy somebody's life really just with words, and you don't have to take a gun and pull the trigger. It can be. And I think that's what your mom was really addressing. The Jews were trying to be very careful. Their judicial jurisprudence system was trying to be very careful in regards to that. We don't want to destroy someone's reputation. We want to restore it if possible, etc. So, do you have anything else, Sin, that you wanted to add to this particular commandment?
Ephesians 4.
Ephesians 4.
26 to 27.
Ephesians chapter 4. Okay, Ephesians chapter 4 is subtitled from 25 down. Do not grieve the Spirit. Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor. For we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. So, again, when someone is angry with somebody else, they may or may not have the full picture and all the information to cause them to be angry or to cause them to have wrath. When the Bible talks about God's wrath, it's wrath against sin, it's wrath against evil, it's wrath against the wickedness, etc. Oftentimes, most often I would say, we don't have all of the information to really come to a totally accurate understanding of almost any circumstance. But again, God would have that information. He would have that insight. Be angry. What does it mean to be angry and do not sin?
Well, I think,
For example, or give me an example of that.
be angry and sin not.
Right.
Well, like my situation in AFCO. Here I was being blamed for something I couldn't possibly defend myself against, and it made me very angry. And at that moment I thought of all the things I could do to basically ruin the pastor's reputation. What I could do to ruin the meetings for him. All those things run through your head. And, but I chose not to. That's...
I think one of the most tragic examples of this would be some of the recent legislation that some states have put forth to abort children
that are newly born,
just prior to their birth or even after their birth. The Bible is specific, not to kill the innocent. It says that almost specifically back in Leviticus. Do not kill the innocent. And yet here is an innocent child, doesn't even have a knowledge of right or wrong, and yet somebody else is going to decide to take their life. And it's not even a humane way that it typically happens. It's a barbaric way. And I get so angry at that kind of attitude of how insignificant and cheap life could be. We can just, like it's some pesky animal that we can just get rid of. It's, to me, is just, to me, I get incensed when I think about people sitting around making those kind of choices, for life or death. It's barbaric.
And I'd recently heard that one of the motivations for that process as well has been money, because they said that there's like a medical industry based on like stem cell research, and they rely on aborted material to supply what they're doing, and so they said it's really a huge money industry for them as well. So they're motivated to keep that going.
I don't even know how we can debate the issue.
When you start denying God in your life, how can you go to all these extremes?
Yeah, how can we even, as civilized thinking people, how can we even debate whether to take a child's life or not? Right? There is no debate about that kind of thing, and that makes me angry. You can tell right now I'm getting angry about it.
Well, just be angry and sin not, Father.
Yeah. But again, it's the same thing that happened to you, Elijah. Your mind goes to the place where, how can I stop this? How can I stop this?
Scott mentioned here that there was no real condemnation of Moses killing the Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew.
Right.
So apparently, under certain circumstances where you're defending or protecting,
right, exactly.
That kind of thing must be kind of at least understood.
Yeah, and of course there were repercussions, and of course God used those repercussions to get him over to unteach him, unlearn him.
To unlearn, yeah.
Yeah, to re-educate him for what the greater mission that he had. as an individual. So, at any rate, I see our time is pretty well expired, and Sin has retreated. So, we'll wrap it up there. Again, a lot of these principles are a lot broader. One of the things I wanted to bring out here in closing is that God is really specifically speaking to the men in Exodus 20 here. It's the men that are the priests of the households. For example, when you look at some of the other commandments there, that the Bible says there that the 10th precept there, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house or his wife. He's speaking to the men here.
Yeah.
He didn't say spouse, he said wife.
So women can covet other people's husbands, but
But I'm saying there that when you think,
That's
for example, this commandment, thou shalt not kill, it probably would have been almost exclusively a non-issue with women killing anything. You understand?
Probably didn't happen very often.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine a woman wanting to, even if a woman gets upset and hates somebody, typically back here in this culture there, they wouldn't think about taking someouse life. It just wasn't.
I think there is something innately different in the way women are wired, because we give birth to children, so we are connected to that life-giving process.
Yeah.
And I think that it makes us much more sensitive to it, and you really have to get past all of your hardwiring, all of your
programming,
to get to the place where you can agree to harm your unborn child.
Yeah. And again, this is a culture where, when you look at that particular commandment, and we'll do that a little later in a couple of weeks, but here the woman is kind of considered a possession. Don't covet the house, the wife, the animals, the servants, anything, right? It's a possession. So in this culture, they weren't the decision makers. They weren't the heads of the family or the priest of the family. So when God's talking with these commandments, He's talking to the men specifically.
God said murder begins in the heart. Matthew 5:21-26.
Yeah, it does. And unfortunately, that's what developed with the Jews. They wanted to actually murder the Son of God. So.
and that would be another interesting portion of a topic for one day eventually, is the subject of feminism and women's roles in relationships.
Yeah, where it has come to compare to what God kind of originally.
We'll talk about a man's role. We'll talk about a woman's role.
Sure.
But I mean, is what you were saying about women. From the perspective that the commandment is speaking to men, there's obviously a very what so many people don't realize is the beauty of what God had worked out in the situation of communicating the relationship He has with the Father, and how a spouse, husband and wife situation works as well. Being equal yet submissive.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's a form of respect.
Yeah. So I mean, that would be an interesting.
Just like we're submissive to Christ.
Well, that's the whole point. It's just a chain of submission going up, and if the man is submitted to Christ, then the woman would have nothing to worry about being submitted to the man, and
Right.
so on down the chain.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's.
But here today we have this huge backlash of women
Oh, yeah.
saying like, it's considered
Anything you
awful
can do, I can do better.
to be submissive to a man, or to be
Right, and
they're
then,
touted
and
as
then,
some
and then our
inequality.
law wants to give women really the authority to play God, to decide if they want that child to live or die. It's totally preposterous to me. But anyway. All right, so we'll pick up the Exodus, back in Exodus 20, we'll pick it up next week. And with the next commandment there. And Sin will probably be back in the captain's chair. But for right now, thanks everybody for tuning in. We're going to let Elijah close us in prayer. And then we're going for lunch.
Right. Father, we thank you so much for the Sabbath and for this time that you've allowed us to be together. We want to again just lift up in prayer the Compton family and those around us, even our own relatives and those who are watching online, for the different health issues that everyone deals with. God, you've given us so much information on how to be healthy and how to serve you and do things like that, that we just ask that you would continue to put this information in our hearts and our minds and help us to be lights for these people who are suffering in this world, and to always remember the eternal perspective that this life is very temporary and that we are just passing through on our way to something greater. And we thank you for all the opportunities of life that you provide us. So we ask that we can continue to shine the light that you've given us and to be more like your Son. That you bless the time that we have together here as a family, and for those that were online that were able to join us. And ask that we enjoy the meal together, and that you would help it to empower us to accomplish your will and to serve you the best we can. This we ask and pray in the name of your Son.
Amen and amen. Thank you very much. All right, folks. Well, again, we'll catch up with you next time, same place, same time. And until then, have a great week. May God